Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Sydney and I work at Peters Township Public Library. We have some folks here at the library to watch, and we have some people joining us via Zoom. So if you are joining us via Zoom, please know that you can turn captions on with Zoom. They have live captioning so everyone can watch captions at home. And Craig has asked that we hold questions till the end. So without further ado, Craig LeHoullier lives and gardens in Hendersonville, North Carolina as of January 2020. Prior to that, he and his wife and pets resided in Raleigh for 28 years. A Rhode Island native, he caught the gardening passion from his grandfather, Walter, and dad, Wilfred. Craig achieved his PhD in chemistry at Dartmouth College, which resulted in a 25-year career in pharmaceuticals that ended in 2009. Craig's gardening obsession, which started the year he and Susan were married and their first garden in 1981, is passing through several stages. His love of heirloom tomatoes began with his joining the Seed Savers Exchange, which is how we learned about him, an organization for which he continues to serve as advisor for tomatoes in 1986. He is responsible for naming and popularizing many well-known tomatoes such as the Cherokee Purple, Lillian's Yellow Heirloom, and Lucky Cross. In 2005, he added amateur tomato breeding to his garden resume and continues to co-lead the dwarf tomato breeding project, responsible for creating 145 and counting new compact growing varieties for space challenge gardeners. His writing career kicked off with a 2012 request from Story Publishing to write a book about tomatoes, resulting in Epic Tomatoes, which we have for checkout here at the library. His second book, Growing Vegetables in Straw Bales, which we also have here at the library available for checkout, soon followed. Book 3, focusing on dwarf tomato breeding project, which we will hopefully have here at the library, is in progress and should be completed during 2024 as a self-published creation. Craig decided to formally close the dwarf tomato breeding project in December 2023. Craig is a popular lecturer across the country at major gardening events and via Zoom from his home office, as well as a frequent guest on podcasts and radio shows. His current and upcoming projects include a weekly Instagram Live each Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern from his garden throughout the growing season, typically from March to September, and additional opportunities on podcast webinars and speaking opportunities as they arrive. Perhaps the most exciting current venture is a collaborative online tomato course, Growing Epic Tomatoes, with world-renowned gardener Joe Lempill, as part of Joe's Organic Gardening Academy. The second season of the course launched in late February 2022, and as of autumn, the course is now evergreen, available to purchase and experience at your convenience. Thanks for being here tonight, Craig. And just a reminder, if you are watching from home, to leave your camera and microphone turned off, and we'll do questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sydney. And I really appreciated the request to do this talk. There will be some tomatoes in it, although this is a more wide-ranging talk about containers and straw bale gardening. And just to locate myself as to your area, I've been in the Pittsburgh area twice, once at the Mother Earth News Fair and once at the Pittsburgh Botanical Garden. Had a great time at both. So got a lot of material to cover. I really love doing this talk. I usually get asked to speak about tomatoes, and it's been interesting that the last few years, it's shifting more and more to garden history, the dwarf tomato breeding project, and this one. Why I love this one is this helps everyone realize that they can garden even if they don't have the perfect dirt garden plot. So I always like to start by orienting people to what's going on in my yard. And this is my backyard garden to be. Somehow this is our 5th year in Hendersonville. 28 years of our gardening was done in hot, humid, crowded Raleigh. And we're just so happy to now be living out here at 2,500 feet elevation, an area that has not seen a flake of snow in 2 years. It's the mountains. It's Western North Carolina. Go figure. But this is our septic field, so the garden goes on top of this. I took these pictures today. It is getting so nice out. So my wife and I have spent the last 2 days starting to get all of the garden furniture out of the garage and just see what's popping up. I did not plant the crocus, but somehow we have crocus of 4 or 5 different colors all over our front. Thank you, squirrel, rabbits, or birds, sitting in front of a hellebore that we just planted. So now let's get into the topic. So all of the tomatoes that are sitting on this table were grown in containers or straw bales. I have not had a traditional in-ground garden, oh my gosh, for 10 years or more. But there's a lot of 1 pound, 2 pound tomatoes here. I call this picture, this is the tyranny of the harvest. This is when everything's coming in at once. Fruit flies are finding the rotting tomatoes, and you have to eat them and can them and give them away. All of these different types of peppers were grown primarily in containers, some of them in straw bales, sweet peppers, hot peppers, you name it. All of these eggplant, and none of these eggplant are ones you can yet buy in a catalog. My amateur plant breeding also ranges to peppers and eggplant, and these are all selections from the Johnny's Hybrid Orient Express, except that green and violet one in the upper right, which came from the bees playing around with, what was it? Might have been Casper, the white eggplant. These are from last year. Bush beans and straw bales have become one of the most important crops, and this is one day's picking out of 4 straw bales. And I'll show you how that was oriented and how we make that happen. And this is also a basket of produce from last year. We sort of went with some of the more unusual shaped summer squash. I think that was 8-ball zucchini. Trying to think of what variety that was. It was a sunburst type of a patty pan, and that's Benning's green tint. And the cucumber was unagi, which is a really nice, one of the bitter-free cucumbers that Johnny sold. So I told you that I've been growing in containers and straw bales for a long time, but before I did that, this is a scene of where the garden was when we lived in Raleigh, North Carolina. Prior to that, we had gardens in Westchester, Berwyn, and Villanova, Pennsylvania. So I hand dug this garden in 1992 and got really good results from it. But you'll see that the garden is surrounded by some very tall growing trees, primarily loblolly pines and tulip poplars that grew really fast and significantly reduced the amount of sun in this plot. So I had to switch to where the sun shone in my yard, hence the title of this talk, Gardening Where the Sun Shines Best in Your Yard, which was my driveway. So what are some of the things that you can avoid by starting to switch some of your gardening, if not all of it, because maybe you've been avoiding gardening because you didn't have that perfect sunny spot in the ground, to straw bales and containers? Well, you end up avoiding drainage issues because heavy clay soil can hold a lot of water and not drain well at all, whereas nice, loosely worked raised beds or containers and straw bales literally cannot be overwatered. In fact, we in Hendersonville have been having some extremely heavy rains in the summers recently, and a lot of my farmer friends and garden friends are really worried about standing water in their garden. And with straw bales and containers, anything just washes right through, and you end up not having plants that are drowning. When you garden in a traditional dirt garden, rotation can be really difficult. And so you can, over time, build up diseases. And for example, with tomatoes, you can build up things like fusarium wilt. It can last in the soil even after you rotate away from it for 3 to 5 years or more. Using containers allows you to avoid disease issues. Oftentimes, you'll have your garden that is discovered by critters marauding through. This actually was even in my driveway garden in Raleigh, where the deer got very clever and they started crawling under my chicken wire fence or jumping it and taking big bites out of the tomatoes. But by figuring out in your yard where the critters can be controlled in terms of their access, you can avoid some of that. So I show this slide in my tomato talk because there is a distinct relationship between the size of the tomato you grow and the amount of hours of direct sun that the plant receives. So if you want to grow a mortgage lifter like that big tomato on the left, you really need 8 hours of direct sun. Now, let's say that you have a garden plot in the dirt that only gets 3 or 4 hours of direct sun, but you have some corners of your yard that do get 8 hours. You can grow your really sun-hungry vegetables, such as tomatoes and peppers and eggplant that love the heat, in straw bales or containers in the area of your yard that gets the most sun. Those who have seen me do my talks know how much I dislike putting lots of words on a slide, but this is a technique talk. I think of gardening as we all have a tool belt. We have the dirt garden and the straw bale garden and the container garden and raised beds as 4 of our potential tools. We also could have greenhouses and hydroponics. But when describing a tool, a way to grow that may not be familiar, sometimes doing comparisons works best. So in the left column, the bullet points are for the traditional dirt garden. Then in the right column, it's for container gardening. So for dirt garden, like I've said several times, the sun may not shine. That may not be where you get the most sun, but growing containers allows you to bring the garden to the sun. Where are you going to do your work with a garden? Creating it, digging into that sod, turning it over, and then weeding it in subsequent years when you plant it. Whereas with container gardening, it's going to be lugging the bags of dirt. If you make the trips to the Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever the garden center and get the big bags of potting mix, you're going to be putting them in your truck or car and then taking them out and then filling your pots. One thing I learned quite quickly, position your pots where they're going to grow before you fill them, and then regular watering and feeding. You can have drainage worries, as I showed in that picture. With dirt gardens, drainage is not an issue with containers. There is less watering and less feeding with traditional gardens because the roots can go deep and find water and nutrients, whereas in a container, the only water and nutrient available to the plant is whatever is absorbed into the planting mix that the roots can reach within the confines of the container. So there is more involved. As we said a second ago, you can have diseases and critters in the soil and in your yard. You can start absolutely clean with containers. And if you're really concerned about the condition the previous season, you can dump them out and wash them out with very dilute bleach or dilute detergent and remove any of the potential bacteria, fungal, or viral diseases that could impact your plants. You do have a lower cost of goods once you plant a garden. You have a higher cost of goods with containers because you need the container and then you need to purchase what you put in the container. It is easier to manage tall in a garden because you can climb up on a ladder and bang a stake into the ground. Now, as you'll see when I show my backyard garden, even though it's our septic field, the pipes are pretty deep, so I can still use stakes and cages that are secured by driven-in stakes to keep my plants upright. You need often to use a more creative staking technique to keep your plants upright if you're on a concrete surface or an asphalt surface or a wood surface, and we'll cover that. So materials, capacity in crops, well, anything goes for containers, but unless you have an earth box or another container that is a self-watering mechanism, you do need to drain away the excess or else the plants will suffocate. As far as plant size, if we're talking tomatoes and you want to get maximal yield off the tallest growing ones, the indeterminate ones such as Sun Gold and Cherokee Purple, 10-gallon capacity is a good minimum to have. However, I have grown indeterminate tomatoes with very good yields really well in 5-gallon containers with less than 3 gallons of material, but I'm almost treating it like hydroponics with very, very frequent watering and feeding, but the plants did great. 5-gallon is a perfect capacity for peppers, sweet or hot, for eggplants, for dwarf or determinate growing tomatoes. And as far as anything else, you can just use whatever capacity of container that you have for things like beets or beans or garlic or potatoes. Just space them as you would in the ground. I think of raised beds or elevated planters as a form of container. I'm going to show a few pictures of those because you are oftentimes, you don't have an infinite depth the roots can get to. And you have oftentimes a controlled depth of soil that you're planting into. And you have some of the same worries with raised beds or raised containers that you do with containers about watering and feeding. So I was going through this list a moment ago, but if you can grow it in the ground, you can grow it successfully in a container. Before I move on, one thing I need to mention. If you've had disappointment with your yields of bell peppers, particularly in eggplant grown in soil, is because these are two plants that really relish hot roots. So if you elevate the root system and plant them in a container that's sitting above the soil level, you're getting the roots out of the cooler clay that's subsurface and into the area where the sun is going to warm, and you can have yield bumps of 5 or 10 times. So when I used to plant peppers in that garden that I hand dug, 3 or 4 or 5 peppers on a plant. In containers, I'm getting 15 or 20. The heat on the roots makes that much of a difference. But potatoes, carrots, radishes, any types of greens you can think of, flowers, herbs, squash, cukes, beets, beans, and your main task, it's not going to be weeding because you'll probably be mulching, as I'll talk about. It's going to be regular feeding and watering. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. So as an option for containers, pretty much anything goes that holds dirt and has holes in the bottom. And I've used those terracotta colored ones in the rear right are actually plastic. And I've had some of those for 34 years. My wife bought them at a kind of a home goods shop when we first moved into Raleigh. I've used them every year for over 30 years. I don't like to be wasteful about my materials and put plastic and other materials into recycle and landfill. So when I buy something, I use it until it falls apart. Those black plastic grow bags, the one on the left rear, those 5-gallon ones are less than $1. I've had some of them for 15 years now. They have holes pre-punched. You can empty them out and fold them up and store them. And the black actually absorbs the sun and will advance the maturity dates of your crops a bit. So funny story about this, self-watering containers. When Epic Tomatoes came out, Gardener Supply wanted to know if I would like to review some of their products and then blog about them. And so they sent me a few of these self-watering container tomato growers. They might have been kind of a beta because when I was putting them together in the driveway, my wife was hearing me utter words she's not typically hearing coming out of my mouth. The way parts fit together, the way little plastic pieces broke off, but I got them together. And I can honestly say that the plants in them thrived. So there is a well at the bottom that holds water and a wick that dips into a bag of potting mix at the top. And so the plant draws up water as it needs it. You put water in on those holes on the side and you can fill that with water, and any excess water comes out. The problem is they're very pricey. Now, I've got them to trial. I don't think I'm going to get much from Gardener Supply anymore because I write very honest blogs and I wrote both the good and the things that need to be changed about them. But they're very classy, they're very nice, and I'm still using them, and I've had them for quite a few years now. This is a raised planter that I was sent to trial, and I love it. It stands about 4 feet off the ground, holds about maybe 10 inches of soil. And this is the first time I had absolute success with carrots. I was pulling out 6 to 8 inch perfectly straight carrots, and these were planted in a really good quality potting mix. And the spinach does really well. And then some years I'll continue with the spinach. And this is lettuce that I started from seed late winter, and then just transplanted in individual plugs and moved it in. A couple of my favorite lettuces are shown here, green ice, Cherokee, and magenta. This is another raised bed that we trialed and loved. And I've got the lettuce going, I've got beets going in there, and these containers that I have in the black, I brought these from Raleigh. They had collard greens and Swiss chard and kale. I covered them with floating row cover, had them going through the winter, lifted the row cover up in the spring, and we get all the greens that we need out of them. So just wonderful. There's a garbage in, garbage out aspect to container gardening, meaning if you skimp on what you put in the containers, the plants will skimp for you. So if you just go in and get bags of topsoil, garden soil, usually they're the least expensive, they're the heaviest. You dump them out, they may be kind of black and not smell very good. When they dry out, they actually crust on the top and water doesn't absorb in very well. So I like to go for a good quality soilless mix. And a soilless mix is a combination of shredded bark and perlite or vermiculite and peat moss, and it drains well. I make a blend for my containers that's roughly a 3-to-1 ratio of that soilless mix to something like a black cow. Now, the material that I've gone to using, I buy at Lowe's, and it's called Stay Green in a big blue bag, and it's called planting mix. Not planting soil, but a planting mix, because it is that soilless mix. And it works great. I just dump a big bag of that in my wheelbarrow, dump a half a bag of the black cow in, mix it up a little bit, fill my containers, and you're good to go. You've got good drainage, and you've also got a little bit of water retention and some good micronutrients. As far as can I reuse the planting mix? And this is where what I wrote in Epic Tomatoes really has to be changed, because back then I was so paranoid about tomato diseases. My feeling was it's always important to change out your containers if you're growing things like tomatoes. But then I started really looking at the performance of my plants, and they were just doing what tomatoes typically do. They grow, they get some early blight, they get some septoria leaf spot. You remove that blemish foliage. Eventually the plants, after they do what they need to do, are gone, but they grew fine. There was nothing in the soil to attack the roots like fusarium disease. So now what I do is I just leave them, I either leave them out and let them winterize, go through the weather, pull out the remains of the plant, and then they'll typically about be half full. And then I'll just work them up a little bit with the cultivator, put on a fresh layer of potting mix to bring it near the top, and everything's fine. So this saved me hundreds of dollars. When we were gardening on our Raleigh driveway, had about 250 containers, and I probably put $350 or more into the potting mix. And now that I reuse most of it, because very few plants and containers die of something really, really bad, it's a real money saver. I don't know if you have this up in your area, but we have a company called Supersod that primarily is about sodding lawns, but they also make a really nice compost out of leaf mulch and other organic materials. They call it their big yellow bag of soil cubed, and they come and deliver it to your house, and it looks very much like your typical soilless mix. If you're going to fill raised beds and things like that, you could also, I'd be wary of going to some of the local garden centers that sell compost and planting mix, and make sure you go test it out first, because sometimes it's filled with big chunks or things that, bottle tops and things like that. So really important to have control over what you put in your containers. So what's really important is, and this is just in general about gardens, if you use sprinklers, a lot of that water is going to evaporate off. It's not going to reach the roots where it's needed. So I'm a waterer at the bottom of the plants near the root zone, and I use this very simple method of watering my containers. I have nothing at the end of the hose, and I have it running maybe 3/4. And if I have a 10-gallon container, I count to 10. 5-gallon container, I count to 5. I'll probably do this a couple of times a week early in the season when the plant's root system isn't that aggressively taking up the water. But once the plants get big and it starts getting really hot, I'm probably watering daily. To that way, the water's coming out the bottom, that's fine. As far as feeding, I'm very simple with my feeding techniques. I just use a general all-purpose water soluble dissolved at a tablespoon per gallon. It makes a pale blue liquid, and each plant gets about 1.5 cups of that each week. So I'm watering more frequently because I'm feeding more frequently because I'm watering frequently, and the watering will leach out some of the nutrients. And what I do is I read the plant. If the plant is lush and green and it's putting out flowers and the flowers are setting fruit, and this goes for all the different crops, not just tomatoes, peppers, or eggplant, then you're doing something right. I'm not going to go into details about feeding at this point because that's really a more general garden topic, but if whatever you do that works in your regular garden, do it with the containers, but maybe bump up the frequency a little bit. The other thing I'm not showing here, it's also wise to mulch the tops of the containers, because that then will, you're trying to find any way you can do to reduce evaporation out the top of the container. And frequently I will just put a layer of untreated grass clippings or shredded leaves almost up to the top of the rim of the container. If you can set up drip irrigation, soaker hoses, things like that, that certainly will cut down your watering time. And it's always important to read your plants. If you're going out into your garden at noon, the sun is shining, your plants are looking pretty wilty, they're telling you they're not getting enough water. They're either using up what they have, the roots haven't gone deep enough to find it if you're in a traditional garden, but that is your invitation to the dreaded blossom end rot on tomatoes and peppers, where you get the dark leathery spot that forms and just grows. If you can keep your plant stress-free, it's kind of like you, all of us. If you keep yourself stress-free, you're more productive and you feel better. Your plants will do a lot better if you keep them stress-free as well. Decks are wonderful for putting containers on tomatoes. Why? Because you can lash stakes to the railing, and that gives you a way to keep the plants upright. So if you look at the inset picture on the left, you'll see an indeterminate tomato that is about 3 feet tall. And then if you see that same plant on the right, it has grown well beyond the top of the picture. Pay no attention to that much younger person, although that's my wonderful wife of 44 years, Sue, with me there. How about supporting the center driveway grow bags? I used to end up, when I was doing a lot of the dwarf project work, with pickup sticks by the end of the season. And to find out which tomato came off which plant, I was scurrying around trying to look at where the connections were. But then I realized I had piles of spent potting mix or other garden dirt that I had dug out through the years. And if I filled pots with that and seeded them behind the plant, I had a stake in the bag with the plant and a stake in the pot that wasn't going to grow anything, and tied the plant to both. You could keep the plant. This is what I call using a ballast to keep the weight divided between the plant and the pot, and another support in a different container. You could keep the garden quite upright till very, very late in the season. Then I realized you can also use that ballast pot to plant cooler weather things that don't mind being shaded, like lettuce. So this was my Raleigh garden over the last decade there, when I was kicked out of my in-dirt garden because of the growing of the trees. And this is the garden that made the Homeowners Association wonder if they wanted to write me a sternly worded letter that this was not what they wanted to see. But then when I'd give them tomatoes and zucchinis and peppers, the letter never happened, but it can be done. And, you know, when you put a garden like this where people can see it, if it's allowed in the area where you garden, it's a great spot to meet and teach gardeners and answer questions. And it became just kind of a meeting place in the neighborhood to share gardening wisdom amongst all of us. This is just to run through different things that did fantastic in pretty much 5-gallon containers. This is one of my favorite jalapeno peppers called Piñata. And instead of going from green to red, it goes from ivory to yellow to orange to red, has the same jalapeno heat. This plant in this picture must have had about 50 peppers on it. These are eggplant in self-watering containers. And if you could kind of look carefully, each of these plants had about 10 eggplant on it. And this is my variety Midnight Lightning that I developed from Orient Express. Greens, like I had said, they can be overwintered using floating row cover. You can just take your snips and put them in your salads or your stir fries, and it's just a wonderful way to use containers. I love beets, and I love even more beet greens. And I found that by pre-starting the seeds indoors, just like you do tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, and then separate the little seedlings out and put an individual seedling in one plug in, say, a 50-cell plug flat, grow them to 2 or 3 inches tall. You can then just use a pencil to pop that little cluster beet plant out and space them in your container every 3 inches. What you end up doing is not having to weed, because direct planted beets are kind of a pain, and all of your beets end up round and perfect, and it works great. And I think what I was really pleased with is I proved that I can grow a quite large fruited watermelon in a container. So this was a 10-gallon container, and this is one of my favorite watermelons, Moon and Stars. It's from the 1920s. The foliage has yellow speckles. The developing watermelons themselves have yellow speckles. And this is a picture of that one plant with 2 watermelons that are going to get to at least 10 pounds, sitting on newspaper so that the external skin wouldn't burn on my concrete driveway. Raleigh was getting pretty hot by the time we moved out. We had 75 days of 90 degrees or above in 2019, which was another reason that we wanted to come out here, where last year we had 2 days of 90 or above. So that's containers. And now we're going to shift to straw bales. Some of the themes will be similar because in a way you could say a straw bale is a form of a container. It's a form of a, so here's a straw bale, wheat straw. You can use alfalfa straw or buckwheat straw. You really shouldn't use pine straw. But the one that you'll find most frequently is wheat straw. They're about 3 feet long and 18 inches by 12 inches. And when I look at a straw bale, I used to think of the hay rides that I went on when I was kind of a teenager and wasn't really too comfortable because, I don't know, blind dates and things like that. So I got that thought out of my mind. Then you can look at a straw bale and think of Halloween decorations or building materials. I look at a straw bale and I look at 2 20-gallon capacity amounts of perfect loam, of a perfect environment for the roots of your plants that are starting absolutely free of diseases, and you can realize enormous yields from them with advanced maturity dates. So my method of moving through this was in-ground gardening, transition to container gardening, which I fell in love with. Now I'm kind of in the container gardening, moving more and more to straw bale gardening. I'm doing both, but there are some real advantages of straw bales. So where did this technique come from? Well, the reports of an application of using straw bales to grow vegetables happened in the 1950s when some pickle companies used straw bales to grow their cucumbers in. The principles really are out of Ruth Stout's no-work gardening, lasagna gardening, just let things compost down, add things on top, instead of digging things up from the early 70s. It was actually reported on in the literature by someone named Dr. Gary Wade, University of Florida horde agent, who reported the method in the late 1970s in a journal article that he wrote. And then somebody named Don Knight wrote an article for Mother Earth News in 1982. So Joel Karsten put out his book that was kind of a groundbreaking book in the early 2010s, but really the method, what he did was he popularized a method that he discovered and that it has existed. And then when Story asked me to write my book, I read his book and I wanted to take things further and be a little more realistic and honest in terms of what its shortcomings and possible risks are. Because I think as someone who gets a chance to share what I do with gardeners, I think honesty is really, really super important so that it doesn't look like this stuff's magic. Every technique have elements that work well and elements you have to really be careful about. So we're not going to go through this list in its entirety because it really is the same list that I showed earlier in terms of in-ground gardening is on the left. This time straw bale gardening is on the right, and everything is the same. A few changes such as your sweat equity is actually picking up the straw bales. Oftentimes somebody will put them in your truck or they'll be delivered to you, but they're not going to get them to where they're going to be. So you need to get them to where you want to grow them out before you start the processing, because a dry straw bale is really not all that heavy. A well wetted down straw bale is extremely heavy and it ain't going anywhere. So get it where it's going to be. And when you're picking up your bales, be really careful to hang on to those 2 strings tight, because the difference between a straw bale and a pile of mulch is very, very narrow indeed. The reason I've got bale source marked in red is one of the main risks of doing straw bale gardening is by chance getting a straw bale where the wheat straw has been sprayed with an herbicide that remains impregnated in the wheat And then when you plant the bale, that herbicide is still there and kills your plants. Now, the good news is, in all of my years of doing this since 2014 or so, and I would say 300 straw bales, I've had exactly 2 that have killed my plants, but they came from a big box store. I'm not sure if it was a Home Depot or a Lowe's. I found it's very difficult to get somebody who's selling straw bales to be able to tell you implicitly that it is organic. So what I would say is, if this is a methodology that sounds good to you, try some different sources on a small scale. Try 2 or 3 bales from this source, 2 or 3 bales from that source, then keep good records of how they do. How I found out it was killing my plant was I put a sun gold in a straw bale, 2 of them exactly. They grew to about a foot tall, maybe 18 inches, and then they just wilted all the time, even when I watered them. So I cut the top 6 inches off, put it in a glass of water, it perked up, it rooted. Then I planted it in a container and it grew perfectly. So the bales were definitely killing my plants. But I don't want that to scare you off from trying this. The price of straw bales and the availability varies widely. When we moved into Hendersonville, I think I paid $6. COVID affected the price of everything. I think this year I'll be paying $7.99 for my straw bales. This is how you make this work. There's a preparation involved. And let's say that I wanted to plant my garden in 2 weeks because there was not going to be any more frost. I would buy my bales and start this process today. Now, I could start this process today, and let's say I don't want to plant out for a month or a month and a half. That's fine, and you don't have to redo this. So this is the 2-week prep you need to do to get it going, but then they can sit for a while. So if you find good availability or a good price, buy them, position them, get your 2-week treatment going, and then plant them when the weather is right. So you position your bales, you apply a heavy nitrogen dose, and I would say my gardening style is organic in intent and on the way to organic, but I'm not totally there yet. So I will use some non-organic fertilizers and such. I will use, to get my straw bales going, a 2805 lawn starter. And I'll apply a half a cup of that to each bale every other day for a week. And then you deeply water. Now, on those days you're not giving them the nitrogen, you're deeply watering again. So for 2 weeks, you're going to be watering the bales every day. And that's about 30 seconds of water to really saturate them. So days 1, 3, 5, you're putting your high nitrogen. And if you are strictly organic, you can use blood meal, you can use fish emulsion. So this is a technique that you can use no matter what type of gardening you are in terms of your gardening philosophy. Then you do half doses of nitrogen 3 days in a row. So I'm using 1/4 cup on each bale and water afterwards. Then I'm going with a balanced fertilizer, a 10-10-10 granular, 13-13-13, whatever you can find that's in that range, or strictly organic gardeners can use a tomato tone or a plant tone, which are like 5-6-5 or 6-6-6, a full cup per bale. Then you deeply water. And I have here day 12, but I would say day 14 because it's easier to remember. Then you can plant. Now, in the book, in an article that I wrote for Gardener Supply, I talk about measuring the temperature, because you can see by about day 5 or 6, your temperature is heading towards 100, 110, 120. You're starting to chew up the cellulose and form the loam. But I've done this enough now, and I know that it never fails. You don't have to do temperature at all. Start on day 1, do your prep. In 2 weeks, you're ready to plant. So here are your options. There's the Vigoro lawn scale. And where I'm using a half a cup of the lawn starter, you probably, if you were to extrapolate this up, it would be like a lot of blood meal, and you don't want to use, it's expensive and it doesn't smell that great. So I would stick close to maybe half, 3/4 of a pound, I mean, of a cup, not a pound. And there's your 10-10-10 and your plant tone and your 5-1-1. So there are ways to do this and be flexible about it. If anybody has any questions, they can email me. If you have the strings on the top, which means you have more surface area, or you have the strings on the side, meaning you have more height, it does not matter, because I've done multiple crops both ways, and you can orient these the way that they best fit into your garden situation. So for direct seeded things where I'm planting a hill of something or a row of something like snap beans or summer squash, I will actually have the strings up because I have a larger flat top area and I can get more bang for the buck. I've actually started to almost exclusively go strings up, just because I'm gardening a little bit on a hill and I have a little bit more stability with the wider flat surface on the ground. But this is what it looks like when you start your application. You water it, it does not all disappear. It slowly leaches into the straw bale. So even at the end of 2 weeks, you will still see different types of granules. The first year I gardened here, this is how I oriented the bales in my yard. You can see on the left, there were two groups of 4 bales pushed together, string up. And the front one was for my beans. The rear one was for my squash. And on the right of those were tomatoes, two to a bale. And I kept them upright by having 8-foot stakes driven into the back of the bale. And I would tie the plant to the stakes, and that would keep the bale. The bales get pretty heavy, so they don't usually want to tilt. If you're going to plant hills or rows, then what you do is you get about a 3-inch layer of that really nice planting mix mixed with compost that you would use in your containers. And you either create 2 hills or an area where you would put seeds, or you cover the whole surface. So if you can look at this picture toward the rear, that is covered with a 3-inch layer of potting mix where beans could be sown or other crops. And if you want to be really efficient about watering, you can snake a soaker hose through before you put the planting mix on top, and then you can turn that on once a day to saturate everything. So when you plant plants in a straw bale, you're not adding dirt. What you're doing is at the end of the 2-week prep, or if you've let them sit even longer before you plant better, you can put your hands in and create a crevice, and then just slip your plant in with the planting mix that's around the root zone as deep as if you were planting it in a garden or a container. The only thing you would add to this is with a crevice, you would probably then have some spaces where the bale got pulled apart a little bit. Just level that off with planting mix, and it's probably maybe a handful or 2 for each bale. Then you pat it down and you water it well and put your identifying stake in. And it is amazing. These plants will start growing 2 inches a day before you know it. It's something to behold, actually. Now, when you're doing your straw bale prep, these are ink cap mushrooms, and just about every bale I've done these in Raleigh and I've done them here. Every straw bale that I've purchased starts pushing up these, maybe between weeks 2 and 3 and 4. And they show up in the morning, and then the sun comes out and they just melt away to nothing. They're harmless. They don't harm the plants. The appearance of these is one of the reasons why this would be a great technique to do with children to captivate them into gardening. And because these are wheat straw bales, you will get wheat straw. You will get wheat plants growing. Not a problem. And here you can see 2 tomato plants. And these have probably been in the straw bale for 2 weeks, and they started off as 3-inch seedlings, and now they're over 1 foot tall. We have dogs. We have 3 dogs, and you saw how I had my bales laid out. They use it as an obstacle course, and they have never bumped into a bale or a plant, but they love to go up to the bales in the morning and eat the wheatgrass that pops up. Or you could just clip them with scissors and use them as a mulch on top of your bales. As far as to what to grow in, and the number in parentheses is the number of plants I would grow. 2 tomato plants, and it doesn't matter if it's indeterminate, determinate, or dwarf. 2 eggplants, any variety. 2 pepper plants, any variety. If you're doing some of the compact hot peppers, you could probably put 3 in easily. As far as herb plugs or leek seedlings, or as many as you would plant with the spacing you would have in the ground. So for potatoes, For each bale, I would put maybe 4 seed potatoes, and you want to bury them deep, just like you would in the garden. You could push them down maybe 8 to 10 inches, and then slowly cover them up as the plants come out. Greens at the spacing you would use. Beets, and the left column is really for plugs or plants, or cloves, such as garlic, or a slip, such as sweet potatoes. On the right, it is direct seeding. And I would put my 3-inch layer of potting mix, mixed or compost in the top, and just seed your radishes in, just as if they were a garden, your carrots. For radishes and carrots, you're planting them quite shallow. So I'd make sure that I have newspaper over that and maybe wet it down, just because carrots are very small seeds. And when they germinate, they're very small plants. And they're in that 3-inch layer of potting mix that can dry out quickly on a hot day. So I would just shield those or screen them until you can tell the roots of those carrots get down into the loam that is starting to be prepared from the broken down straw. For each straw bale, 2 hills of cucumbers, maybe 2 seeds each, 2 plants. Same with melons. I made a big mistake. A couple of years ago, I pushed 4 bales together, put my 4 hills, and put 3 squash seeds in each hill and let them all go. And soon I realized 12 summer squash plants at the rate that straw bale squash yields is just overwhelming. Now, another little aside, I have never lost a squash plant to a squash vine borer grown in a straw bale. Now, that's anecdotal, but that's what I've experienced. The other thing with beans, I would, when I do my 4 bales pushed together, I cover the whole top of that 3-inch layer, and I do 3 rows, and I space my seeds 3 inches apart, and it's amazing the yield we got. We were picking our first squash 37 days from direct seeding, which is a testament to how the heat generated at the center of that bale as it composts is going to affect the maturity dates of your plants. And then annual flowers you can direct seed, or larger seeded herbs. So this is kind of a punchline picture of what the garden looked like. This was, I believe, 2022 when Joe and I were filming Growing Epic Tomatoes. And I followed everything that I stated in my book because I wanted to show that it worked. So I was pruning well and I was topping well. And this is gardening with straw bales and containers on top of a septic field. And this is what last year looked like. And if you look carefully in the front, you can see the beans were starting to peter out a little bit. Some of the foliage was starting to get yellow. But if you look in the center front, that is squash plants, way too many squash plants. And then everything behind that were peppers and eggplant and cucumbers and melons and lots of tomatoes. So this is what it looks like. You've got your bean seeds planted in your potting mix, and they pop up right away. You don't have to worry about weeding, which is really nice. This is one of the fringe benefits of growing beans in straw bales, is you can sit in a chair to harvest them. Whereas when you grow beans in the ground, I love bush beans. We've never really been pole bean growers. We like the lower ones, but picking bush beans by bending over in the garden is not fun. Sitting in a chair with your straw bale is. This is when I grew way too many squash in my straw bales. All my seeds are up, but they did incredibly well. This is a straw bale garden from my driveway in Raleigh, showing how beautiful and vigorous the plants get quite quickly. And, you know, all of those flowers are out there. You can pick them and stuff them, and it's just wonderful. This is a way to keep cucumbers upright. So I had my hill of cucumbers, and then once they germinated, I put a useless tomato cage over them, the 4-foot wire cone-shaped tomato cages. And then I secured them with a slanted pole that went into a bucket of dirt. And then what happened is that pole kept the wire cage upright, but the cucumbers crawled right up that cage through the center, and all the cucumbers hung down beautifully nice and straight, and the yields were just enormous. Here you can see again, in the very center are the cucumber plants starting to crawl up. the tomato cages with those slanted poles, keeping the cages secure. Eggplant and straw bales. Again, you're elevated. The sun is shining in those bales and heating up the root zone. Yields are enormous. Bell peppers starting to really crank them out. Those are a couple that I developed from the Islander hybrid, and I'm continuing to work on those. A nice idea for space saving is if you've got 2 tomatoes in a straw bale, you can, until the plants get enormous, you can plant some basil in between. Fantastic for things like Swiss chard, bright lights, one of our favorites, and also red Russian kale. And these are what you get when you plant those little beet plugs into that layer of potting mix on bales. And that's the variety Chioggia, which is the one when you cut it, it has the zoning. And so we're just about done with content and getting to questions, but I just wanted to say that when Story asked me to write straw bale gardening, I said, well, I'd love to write another book, but I don't want to write it until I prove that it's going to work okay. So I spent a couple of years in Raleigh. We had a fellow who was a sheriff who was the local straw bale gardening expert. And I talked to him, brought him coffee, saw what he was doing. But the punchline to this one is, just before I agreed to sign the contract, I planted 2 of my favorite tomato varieties, Sun Gold and Cherokee Purple, in the front of my garden when the trees hadn't blocked all the sunlight yet. And I had a Sun Gold in a straw bale, a container, and the ground, and a Cherokee Purple in the ground, a straw bale, and a container. And then I was very happy to report that everything worked equally well. Plant health, plant yield, flavors of the fruit. It was great. And that proved to me that, number one, containers are equally as viable a method as in-ground gardening. And then for the purposes of the book, that straw bale gardening is just a wonderful technique to add to the gardener's tool belt. Just a few slides on the dwarf tomato breeding project. I know some of you on the call have grown some of these, and I hope other people join them. I did formally end the project in December 2023 because it had been going for 18 years. We've had over 1,000 people from every state and lots of countries help, and we have 157 and counting varieties. They're gorgeous plants. They grow at half the upward rate as indeterminates, but fruit throughout the season like indeterminates. So if you grow an 8-foot Cherokee Purple in your yard, your dwarf will be 4 feet tall. They're perfectly happy in 5-gallon containers. The plants are gorgeous and they don't need to be pruned at all. And this is just a few of our favorite varieties that we've released. Dwarf Sweet Sue is the yellow in the upper left. So these are 6 to 8 ounce tomatoes on a 3 to 4 foot tall plant. Furticae, 8 to 16 ounce tomatoes. Dwarf Pink Passion, beautiful, relatively early pink hearts, and a brand new color we discovered, the black orange tomato. An orange tomato that retains some chlorophyll in the green-orange color. It's like the orange version of Cherokee Purple or Cherokee Chocolate. And every single one of our dwarf varieties is being carried by our seed company partner, Victory Seeds. Mike, when he owned it, was so excited about this project, and now the new owner, Dave, is equally excited about it. So when you go to Victory, now lots of companies are starting to sell them, but Victory is where you can get them all. So Sydney said early on, she mentioned that it was my grandfather and my father that is responsible for me babbling on about gardening so often and writing books and getting excited about it every year. Walter Gibbs on the left was my grandfather. Wilfred LeHoullier, that's him holding me in Slater Park Garden in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. They both took me through their gardens, and I just couldn't believe what they were growing. And they planted the seed and it flourished. So all of you have a really fun job, which is to grow your own gardener or gardeners, and just get people to understand how wonderful this is. These 2 books, you can check them out at libraries. You can get them on Amazon. If you want signed copies, you can email me and we can work out a deal. I think right now it's both books plus some seeds for $25 total, including everything. My blog is craiglehoulier.com. I'm starting to blog more regularly now. I slow down in the winter, but you can actually go on a few blogs back and see detailed results of every tomato I grew last year, 180 varieties. My email is nctomatoman@gmail.com. The Instagram lives are going to start real soon because I'm going to have some things to start showing. They could be Thursday, they could be Friday. I tend to vary my time depending on the weather and what I'm doing, but if you just follow me at NC Tomato Man and look at my posts, I always let people know a few days in advance. And then Growing Epic Tomatoes is out there. And I was at a coffee shop working on my book for 3 hours the other day. So it is underway. And there's my list, my current list of favorite tomatoes. So Sydney, thanks for the invitation. All of you who are online or will watch this in the future, thanks so much for spending time with me tonight. And I'm ready to answer any questions that you have, but thanks again.
And thanks for being here tonight with us. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or speak them aloud. Real quick, I did want to share people who are in our library area and remind you, we do have a seed library here at the library. So I've been working on repackaging butterfly seeds right now, which is a native PA pollinator to get out for people. And then we also have some other upcoming gardening-esque programs. So someone who's also on our call, Dr. Candy DeBerry, will be giving a talk about landscaping with native plants the beginning of April. At the end of April, we have our yearly plant swap. In mid-May, our local gardening group has a plant sale. At the end of May, we have designing a deer-resistant garden with Dr. Mark Miller from the Pittsburgh Botanic Gardens. And then in the summer, we're going to have a seed saving program with our local Washington County Master Gardeners, as well as a Preserving Your Harvest, a canning program. And then later this summer, we hope to have a tomato tasting when all of our tomatoes are coming in.
Good. And Sydney, I will mention if anybody there is working with Master Gardeners, I always have spare dwarf varieties because the fellow who grows them out always grows like thousands of seed and I get them. And then I think I went through 1,000 coin envelopes in the last 3 months just sending seeds out to people. So if you want to have some nice short growing plants in any of your gardens, just get in touch with me and I'll send you a selection.
Sounds good. What's your favorite cucumber variety for bags or bales? The question from Mike.
So Mike, I love the bitter-free ones, and it was always Diva because they're just like candy, and the seeds are very small. They're on the small side, but my wife has actually pickled them with good effect. The problem with Diva is it seems to be a bit more disease-prone for things like mildew, and for whatever reason, both the stripes and the spotted cucumber beetle seem to be very happy with them as well. So the last 2 years, we've gone to another really nice bitter-free one. I think they call them Be It Alpha types, originally from the Middle East, and it's called Unagi, Unagi. It's a hybrid, but it hangs in there much longer in the season before it gets attacked by mildew or disease, and the flavor is just amazing, and it pickles well. I don't have extensive experience with cukes just because to me, it's a homegrown cuke or a store-bought, waxy, watery, bitter, yuck, why am I eating this cuke? So I tend to just like the really good thin skin. And I actually even peel the thin skinned ones just because I like that crisp, crunchy inside with nothing to get in the way. So
we have another cucumber question from Sam in the UK. Have you tried Delastar cucumber? Not sure if available over there, but very thin skin, easily digestible. I grew them last year, love them, also bitter free.
I'll look for that. I have grown a really interesting variety called Punakira, which kind of look like potatoes. They're one of the ones that's kind of a yellowish brownish color, and they're really delicious. The thing is they're kind of round, and so you do have kind of a wide seed area in the middle that makes them a little bit more watery. But you know, cukes are fun. I've got to try to get myself reincarnated at least a dozen times so I can dig into corn, melons, cucumbers, and all the other things that I've had to leave in the rearview mirror while I've concentrated on the tomato, pepper, eggplant stuff. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam, for that.
And you mentioned moon and stars, and I have a seed envelope of moon and stars back here that we got from Seed Savers as well.
Yeah. So there's a really great story about that where Kent Wheely, who formed Seed Savers, was looking for it for years, and he thought it was extinct. And it turns out a farmer who lived just a few miles from him in Missouri had a field of them, and he was probably the only person in the world that still grew them. So he thought, I can make a lot of money off this. And Kent said, no, what you can do is give some to me and we'll share them through the Seed Savers Exchange. And if everybody grows them, then they won't go extinct. And that's how they're actually a variety that was released by the Hendersonville Seed Company in the 1920s, and it was only in seed catalogs for about 3 years. So it is very, very rare.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Mr. LeHoullier this evening? And while we wait to see, I just want to thank you again so much for spending time with us. And remind everyone that if you're local, if you go to ptlib.org/seed library, that's where we list whatever seeds we currently have in our seed library. So we're slowly working on rolling them out. And then we list all upcoming gardening programs on there as well.
I just, what I want to do, I guess, to end, and there's still time for questions if people ask them, is having a community of garden friends there's nothing like it. And I kind of joke about the Instagram lives that I do and all this, but they're really important because we're getting this group of people together from everywhere that share this common passion. And my last phrase on this is I think gardeners are going to have to save the world because a lot of other people don't seem to be interested in doing it right now. So I think we can do it. And we don't need to know anything about each other except that we love plants. And that's incredible and rare.
Sam said she wishes she could grow watermelons as well, but then she says, or Sam says, I wouldn't stay up this late for my friends here, gardening friends, though. I'm here. Thanks, Sam, for staying up. Dr. DeBerry says, thanks so much, Craig. What varieties would you suggest for the very largest tomatoes? Eyeing the prize at the county fair, as always.
Oh, right. I got some ideas for you. So some people have shared some really big varieties with me lately, and there's one that Victory Seed sells called Shackelford Family Heirloom that I grew to 3 pounds. There's another one called Giant Syrian that I grew, and I don't try to grow large tomatoes. So when they get this big, they do it of their own accord. Giant Syrian. And another one would be Halliday's Mortgage Lifter. And there's another real rarity called McCutcheon that my friend Adam shared with me from an elderly man in West Virginia. So if you want to try seeds of any of these, just drop me an email and I'll get some off to you. But I would love to see somebody push the envelope on Shackelford and some of these monsters that get so big, it's just unbelievable. But they're delicious. The thing is, they're not only big, they're wonderful to eat. So that's kind of a nice thing to have as a combination.
Well, I think that's going to be it for us. So thank you again so much for being with us this evening, Craig. And thanks for everyone who joined us at the library and from home to listen to him speak.
Right. Stay in touch, everybody. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good evening, everyone.